Israel was proven to be not invulnerable, and we don't know the half of it. Iran now has hypersonic missiles. They can do a hell of a lot of damage and cannot be defended against. Russia, China, the Iranians, and Trump are worried. We got a Samson option that Netanyahu might employ, and he's prepared to do just about anything to keep his rear end out of jail. Is that enough for a human being to risk nuclear war? The Israelis are really good at false flag attacks. When I saw that the USS Nimitz was ordered to make the trek to Mideast waters, I said, oh, wow. These things are sitting ducks. Do I think he's capable of that? Yeah, I do. We're not talking about a normal human being. We're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi, folks. Canadian Prepper here today. It's an honor to have Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst and presidential briefer turned outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy. With decades of insider experience and fearless candor, Ray brings sharp insight into intelligence, war, and truth in a time of great deception. And we've seen that unfold in the last few weeks. I mean, it's dizzying, Ray, the levels of deception that we're currently seeing in the run-up to this whole intrepid endeavor with the Israelis and the decapitation strike and all that. We were told that Trump and Netanyahu were at odds and they were fighting it out, and Trump was shouting at him on the phone and reining him in and all this stuff. And what do you make of the events of the last few weeks? Is this something, having spent so much time giving the daily presidential briefs to the president back in the day, could you ever imagine that we would get to the place where we're at right now in terms of how how politics is conducted?
I know. That's a simple answer, Nate. Sorry, but no, I could never imagine this. And in reality, I'm in the uncomfortable position of trying to predict what is de facto unpredictable. And that is what Trump is going to say in the next 30 minutes, whereas compared what he said 30 minutes ago. So my focus, of course, has been on the Soviet Union and Russia for more decades than I want to admit here. But I try to put myself in the perspective of how Putin or Xi Jinping might look at what's going on. I think that it's pretty clear to everyone in a nutshell that the whole idea here on the part of Netanyahu was to mousetrap Trump into joining in his war against Iran with both feet. He sort of succeeded in doing that. Why Trump was briefed that this would work? Well, Trump was briefed 2 years ago that Putin had lost in Iran, right? I mean, had lost in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what the intelligence community is saying. On this one, they were tempted. They made some sense in terms of the fact that they reiterated the judgment that Iran was not working on a nuclear weapon. But then we had that clown called Rubio, who's not only the Secretary of State, but he's he's the assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, for God's sake, The last time that happened was Henry Kissinger. Now, whatever you think of Henry Kissinger, I think you will agree that Marco Rubio is no Henry Kissinger. Now, here was one interesting episode. Sunday, Rubio is told by the boss to go on Face the Nation. Margaret Brennan is usually a pretty sympathetic person, and, she knows what the rules are, except she forgot. She nailed him. She made a fool of him. She said, well, how can you do these things? How can you say these things when the intelligence community has been saying since 2007 that Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon? And so what's irrelevant? She says, irrelevant? Well, yeah, it doesn't matter what the community would tell. She said, well, tell me that again. And then, we have this expression ever since, yeah, I think it was Senator, the guy who from Tennessee, the head of the Senate for a long time, Senator so and so said to Elizabeth.
I'm not sure who it is.
Yeah, okay. Oh gosh, his name is escapes me, but he said to Elizabeth Warren, you ought to stop talking about all these things, and she kept going, and the senator said, nevertheless, she persisted. Well, hello. Nevertheless, Margaret Brennan persisted. So what I'm saying here is there's a ray of hope. There are programs like yours, and there are lots of other outlets that are gaining in strength and popularity. So people can find out if they're interested, and they have enough time to find out what's really going on. And what's going on here is very simply that Iran tried to rope the U.S. into a full-scale war against Iran for regime change, not because of enrichment of uranium or not because nuclear weapons are being developed. They're not. Regime change. Now, the Israelis probably thought that if they decapitated the 8 top Iranian officials and then went on to have Mossad assassinate many of the nuclear scientists, that Iran might say, oh my God, all right, we give up. Hello? If they thought that, they get just the opposite, okay? They've got a regime that's really together now, like never before. And those he decapitated, there are new caps on those missions, and they're hell bent to prevail. The big thing, of course, is that Iran has a deterrent now for the first time in 4 millennia. It's a long time, all right? That's longer than I've been alive, okay? They have a deterrent. That's why I was confident that Netanyahu probably wouldn't try this except in extremis. Well, they tried it anyway, and he expected Trump to jump in, and Trump jumped in and initially said, excellent, I know all about this. I know everything, a direct quote, okay? But then, as Israel started to lose, well, Trump changed his tune. Well, I didn't really know much about this, and anyhow, in the final analysis, Trump was unable to prevent the neocons that advise him, the military that will go along with anyone, and Netanyahu to get him in and get the U.S. to participate openly in the kind of war of aggression that the U.S. and the U.K. and others did against Iraq back in 2003. Well, what happened? Oh my God, it didn't turn out very well because the Iranians have this deterrent. The reason I thought that Netanyahu would never try this, and the deterrent is hypersonic missiles against which there is no defense. Patriot missiles, HIMARS, all this other stuff, no defense against these hypersonic missiles. And Israel is taking really bad damage, and we don't know the half of it because Reuters and AP and Al Jazeera was not able to report on this damage. So finally what happened, seems to me, is the Israelis said, oh my God, how many of these hypersonic missiles does Iran have? And they came up with a figure of thousands. And then they say, well, how many do we have? How many missiles do we don't have? We can't defend anyway with these missiles. So, hey, Trump, would you get a ceasefire? And we'll kind of regroup, see what we can do. And then we can brag about destroying the Iranian facilities, which, of course, were not destroyed. So that's how I pieced together what happened. What we're in now is a ceasefire, which frankly I don't expect to last very long. I hope I'm wrong on that. But meanwhile, you have Russia and you have China. You have other main countries, Turkey, India, people very sympathetic to Iran now. Iran is part of BRICS. And even though even though Trump has turned his attention away from Ukraine to Iran and helping Israel, I mean, it's been a fool's errand on both sides here because, well, we talk often about robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Well, he's robbed Peter Zelensky to pay Paul Netanyahu, and I mean, Patriot missiles. Let's say they thought they were going to work. They don't. Okay, so he's got to go into Zelensky, and they say, "Oh, wait a second, we'll change the destination." Well, give them to Netanyahu. So, what about? I'll just finish on this. What about Ukraine? We had the most interesting NATO summit just today. It ended in The Hague in the Netherlands. Nobody is pointing out the stark difference between this one and the one just last year. Last year, the Russians were accused of invading Ukraine, and Russians are the big bugbear, okay? And Ukraine has a irreversible path into NATO. Communique last year. What does this year's communique say? Nothing. Nothing about Ukraine's irreversible entry into NATO. So I guess irreversible really was supposed to be reversible. Anyhow, that's big. And it's, the best sign that Trump read him the riot act. Don't criticize Russia to the way you want to. Don't feature this business about Ukraine can prevail. They can't prevail. I think that the U.S. is going to cut off all weapons supply. It probably will cut off eventually the supply of very valuable intelligence that the Ukrainians use. The fly in that ointment is that the UK will probably give them what they need anyway. So Ukraine is pretty much, well, I would sing a requiem for Ukraine. Rest in peace. They're not going to get any more help from the United States. And these people in Europe, whom I call the coalition of the brain dead, they're not going to be able to do what the U.S. had hoped to do. And, they may build up their military potential against the notion that the Russians are going to invade the rest of Europe. But that's notional, right? Really notional. There's not a scintilla of evidence that that has any validity to it. And I think even the Europeans, when they get rid of these klutzes, these political hacks, they'll say, hey, look, do we want to build up and waste all our money against a notional Russian threat? Or do we want to take care of our people, like even including poor people? We have a safety net. Europe used to be famous for taking care of everybody. Well, are we going to sacrifice this for a notional threat that can't be proven by Russia against NATO? I think they come to their senses. The problem is people will keep dying. The last Ukrainian will die pretty soon. And peace is a long way away. And it will have to be dressed up in some kind of way so that Europeans and the Americans can say, well, we got something out of this. Is that possible? I do think that's possible because Putin and Trump both want to put this thing aside. And there can be enough lipstick stuck on this pig of defeat for NATO and Ukraine that the combination could be reached, but probably not for several months now until people come to their senses. Let's pray that they do. I have no guarantee that will come anytime soon.
Interesting. You said a lot of interesting things there. The one thing I did observe at the NATO conference that for the first time in a long time, Zelensky was wearing a suit, which, if nothing else, indicates that perhaps that's an indication that they're starting to have to look at off ramps and actually come to some real rapprochement with the Russians. But I want to go back to what you were talking about with respect to Iran. Now, you're not an architect, as far as I know. Maybe you have some experience in looking at these kinds of things. You did presidential intelligence briefs for some time, so maybe you know a bit more about how it works. But when U.S. bombers were leaving Iranian airspace, long before they had ever returned to, I think it was Whitman Air Force Base, the president had already come to the absolute conclusion that the Fordow facility was completely obliterated. Is it physically possible to determine with 100% certainty within such a short period of time, unless they maybe had somebody inside the facility that was a spy or something, is it at all possible that they could have ascertained that information with 100% confidence at that period of time?
Well, if you're a human being, the answer is no. But if you know everything, as Trump does, of course it's yes. Trump makes up a lot of things, right? There was no way that they could have been sure. It used to be that military officers of high rank, even sometimes Air Force officers, would tell the truth, would not shrink from avoiding making overarching claims that couldn't be proven. That guy from that Air Force guy, what's it, General Raising Kane? My God, very, very good briefer, isn't he? Wow. He says, "Well, we don't have the bomb damage assessment, but it was kind of just a real blast. We killed them. That didn't happen." And now we have a Donnybrook with the intelligence people, some of whom have the guts to tell the press this is a lot of BS. Not only weren't they obliterated, but when they were struck, the highly enriched uranium wasn't even there. Okay. It had been moved a couple of days before. We saw it in photography. So this was theater, pure and simple theater. Now, unfortunately for Trump, that came out just as he's going to NATO. Nobody called him on that. At least I haven't seen the whole press conference. But so he danced around that. But, it's just kind of, it's kind of par for the course, except there was, I did see one, I think she CNN, she asked the president, where do you get this obliteration stuff? I mean, do you believe the Israelis? She says. And he said, no. He said the equivalent of, hey, you forget? I know everything. I'm afraid we have a person who's just as sick in a different way as Joe Biden was. Joe Biden was not compos mentis. Donald Trump is delusionary. He's got delusions of grandeur and of invincibility that I'm afraid he's going to have to take it on the chin when he finds out this is not so. And to the degree he has a bunch of little chinovnik, little bureaucrats and sycophants around him, it's going to be for a while before he finds out what the real score is. Meanwhile, he'll ask Marco Rubio to say what he should say, and Witkoff as well. Steve Witkoff is also going off crazy, saying the things that Trump wants him to say.
It seems as though they're doing immense amounts of damage control with respect to this supposed leak that indicated that the attacks on the Iranian facilities were not successful. There's somewhat of a contradiction in that now Trump is seeking to limit classified info sharing with Congress after the Iranian leaks, which seems kind of weird if you're denying that the leak is real. Why would you, like, if you're saying that it's fake news, why would you need to impose restrictions on fake news? Like if you're outright saying that, like even Tulsi Gabbard just came out with a statement, which is surprising, that President Trump's decisive leadership and the brave servicemen and women who flawlessly executed a truly historic mission to keep the American people safe and secure. She initially claimed that they were not making nuclear weapons. Then she kind of did a bit of a 180 before the bombing campaign. And now we're seeing the same obsequious behavior by the Hegseth and Rubio. Now it's even Tulsi Gabbard. What is with this? Like, what are they trying to hide here? Why are they so, like, they really seem to be concerned about this, that this leak that supposedly they're saying is fake. And I guess, like, what does it mean for the war going forward?
Well, it means a lot for Trump's credibility. Um, Obliterate, everybody says obliterate. And then the vice president says, well, maybe not completely obliterate. We have to look for the bomb damage assessment. And then, various people say various things. And all of a sudden, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which on occasion has stood up for the truth, it was people within the agency that leaked to the press. And what they leaked was a preliminary assessment that no, not obliterate, not even harmed. There's plenty of enriched uranium around. But the big thing here is that there's a lot of obfuscation. There are two issues here. Is Iran working on a nuclear weapon? The answer to that is no. Is Iran working on enough enriched uranium to fill a warhead for a nuclear weapon? Yes. Are they close? Yes. Are they within their rights to do that? Yes. It was Trump that got out of the treaty that prohibited that. And even so, the Russians have said, look, you're concerned about the degree of enrichment. We'll take that enriched stuff and we'll keep it under lock and key. So don't worry about it. It's not about this. It's about regime change, okay? So how you obfuscate this is you say, oh, this enrichment, it could be 80. You could see Netanyahu years ago with that bomb at the UN, 90%. Doesn't matter. Gets to 90%, which is what you need for a nuclear weapon. If there's no nuclear weapon, it doesn't matter. And when Rubio was confronted by Margaret Brennan, of all people, it faced the nation. What do you mean? They're not working on a nuclear weapon. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Well, it sure as hell does matter. And I think the American people, if they watch your show here and watch some others, they'll have questions for the first time, perhaps, and not blindly follow what Rubio says when they see that even Margaret Brennan, nevertheless, she persisted, right? When she refuses to just let Rubio off the hook and make a fool out of him. I mean, he is the guy that Trump is relying on, supposedly. Trump never had good judgment with respect to people to rely on. Maybe he's smart enough to realize that he's been misled, misadvised, and turn to people who know which end is up. There's no indication of that yet, but this is so blatant, he can't have it both ways. Either they destroyed Fordo or they didn't. And the obvious evidence so far is that they didn't, and that he was caught in another gigantic whopper. Not the first time, but this is a pretty consequential one.
So if they didn't destroy the facility, presuming they didn't, it appears as though it's just even the Grossi, the IAEA chief, is saying that the actual place where the stuff is stored is not only 100 meters deep, but it's also there's 500 meters of rock on top of that, granite, in fact. Now, okay, so if it's true that the facility is not destroyed, what is their next move then if the goal is regime change? Do they now up the ante, and how do they spin the narrative to come back to, oh, it's a threat again? Like, how are they going to get back to, well, those Iranians, we discovered that maybe there's some nuclear stuff elsewhere. Fordo was destroyed, but we have some new intelligence or something. Are they just going to fabricate something? If the goal is regime change, do they just put a kibosh on the whole thing and wait a few years? Or do you think they're going to try to do something? And is Netanyahu, who, of course, politically speaking, needs to arguably make a move sooner than later, and especially this is probably the most ideal opportunity he's ever going to have. How do you think they're going to resurrect this whole campaign and restart the war?
You're absolutely right. I mean, he's in a bad situation. People forget that it was just a couple of days before he launched a strike on Iran that he almost lost power. Parliament almost, voted that group out. He escaped by appealing to even more rabid extremists. Okay, so he came pretty close. Now, what does that mean for him personally? Well, the case against him for blatant corruption, not one case but several, is so pretty much airtight that if he loses power and goes to trial, he and his nice wife will end up in the bridal suite there in one of those prisons in Tel Aviv. Now, is that enough for a human being to risk nuclear war? Or not a normal human being? We're not talking about a normal human being. We're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, you say, oh, McGovern, you're overstating it. Man, the guy is doing genocide. All right? Now, when I was a boy, I lived through World War II. I was very young. But at the end of it, I heard about genocide. And I said to myself, if I get big, when I get big, I'm never going to let something like this happen again. Okay? I was too little. Now I'm big, all right? And now my country is enabling, arming, politically defending genocide. And this person, the genocider in chief, Benjamin Netanyahu, is getting away with it, okay? And what does that mean? One of the reasons he's doing that is to preserve his coalition so he doesn't lose power and then he doesn't lose his freedom by going to jail. So what's the next question? The next question would be, oh my God, this same guy has purview over 200, 300 nuclear weapons. Now, in extremis, let's say the Iranians keep firing these hypersonic missiles at real targets in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and elsewhere in Israel. Yeah, their naval ports and everything else. Oh, well, what's he going to do? Well, there's a real chance that he would do the Samson option. In other words, Samson pulling down the whole temple around him, right, rather than let somebody else win. Everybody loses. Do I think he's capable of that? Yeah, I do. I mean, he's capable of genocide. He's capable of that. Do I think it's only for his political and his freedom from jail? I think it's probably a large measure of his motivation. And I think, and this is speculation on my part, that Trump got to know that somehow. And the Russians know that, and the Chinese. And I think that Trump has been in touch with these other leaders, and they're saying, look, Mr. Trump, we told you not to get mousetrapped into what you actually ended up doing. Are you going to get mousetrapped into encouraging Bibi Netanyahu to launch his nuclear weapons? Is that the next step here? He's out of control. You thought you control him, you can't. He's controlling you, Mr. Trump, if you let this happen. Now, would that get through to Donald Trump? I suppose, if he's a practical businessman, it could. And I think that's one reason why Trump did arrange a ceasefire and why he was ticked off when the Israelis used those last few hours to shoot about everything they had mounted into Iran. I mean, even Trump can get angry with the Israelis, and maybe it won't last. But let's hope that the reason will prevail here. Some kind of accommodation can be made where Iranian interests here, namely some reasonable expectation that there's not going to be another major attempt at regime change, maybe with what's going on in the UN now and in world politics generally, Netanyahu is so isolated that, if he can only get like Guam and the Palau Islands and his own government in Israel to vote against the UN, it'll be just too embarrassing even for him to continue this campaign against Iran.
I guess my question then would be, how could Iran ever possibly trust the West again, especially when you have J.D. Vance announcing the emergence of the international Trump doctrine after these U.S. strikes on Iran and these negotiations, which were just clearly a ruse for perpetrating this treachery against a sovereign nation like Iran. How could they ever have faith that what we're hearing right now, because I suspect that the reason why they're so uptight about this leak is that perhaps they were trying to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security. Just get the Iranians to admit that, okay, yeah, it's nothing to see here. Our enrichment facilities are destroyed, and hoping that perhaps they would let their guard down so that they could do another decapitation strike. Because clearly, like you said, they need to replenish their air defense. And whatever plan they had for regime change fell short of achieving that. They got close. They tried to create chaos. They tried to, compartmentalize Iran, and they tried to, break down their communications and cause uprisings and all those things, and it all failed. How is Iran ever going to, I can't foresee a world at this point, especially when you allegedly have 900 pounds of 60% enriched uranium out there. Is it just going to be, are they going to just forget about it? Is it going to be a hunt for Red October? I'm just trying to figure out how is this going to go forward here? Is this situation going to be put on ice for a while, or do you think it's going to flare up in the near term again?
Well, it's really hard to say. It really is not a matter of trust anymore. There is no trust. It's a matter of what happened on the ground. Israel was proven to be not invulnerable, okay? Israel took it on the chin. We don't know. We don't have any bomb damage assessments from Israel because they've thrown out the Reuters and the AP and Al Jazeera. They don't let any stuff get out of there, okay? Mm-hmm. So that's the new reality. I think that the Iranians have the upper hand. They're being counseled by the Russians and by the Chinese. Look, go easy. We're winning now. Look how panicky Netanyahu and Trump are. Don't even think about messing around just now with the Strait of Hormuz. We got you covered. We haven't had to make big noises because you're doing very, very well, thank you, by yourself. Let's see how this new reality pans out. Now, the Iranians, will they go back to negotiations with Washington? Not anytime soon, I would wager. Would they, just as a gesture to Russia and China, do this? I suppose that's possible. Would it be possible for the Trump administration to sotto voce say, oh, damn, that didn't work. let's go back to what we had before Trump, foolishly left the JCPOA, the Iran deal, which guaranteed that Iran could not do the kinds of things they're doing now with enrichment and so forth. Now, we can disguise that. We can put a lot of lipstick on that pig, but that's the best we're going to do. If we really want to stop Iran nuclear progress, we could go back to that. But I guess we're going to have to give up on regime change. I'm sorry, but that was the whole idea here. It didn't have to do with nuclear weapons. They're not working on nuclear weapons. We'll just have to tell Netanyahu, look, if you want to survive, you're not going to be able to survive if you provoke the Iranians into new volleys of hypersonic missiles, against which, I'm sorry, but we can't send you enough Patriot missiles. Actually, we can't send you 100 Patriot missiles because they can't cope with the speed with which these things hit the ground. You can see the photos on the thing, right? So, yeah, it's a new situation now. Reality has to set in here, and maybe Trump has been educated a little bit more about how vulnerable he is to being mousetrapped by Netanyahu. It's an unresolved question in my mind whether Trump was so cynical as to say one day, the negotiations are going on. We're looking for some success in that. And the next day, bless Netanyahu taking off after Iran. What I think happened, and this is speculative, I think he was mousetrapped. I mean, we've always said U.S. presidents can be and have been mousetrapped by Netanyahu. I think he kind of knew generally what Netanyahu had in mind, but his neocon advisors knew more, and his military people. And so that on the evening of the 12th of June, he was invited down to the Situation Room. Come on, Mr. President, I want to show you something really interesting. And just as the Israelis started bombing and missiling Iran and decapitating its leadership, Trump is looking at all this and he watches for his attention span of 20 minutes. And he said, my God, wow, what happened to Iran's vaunted defenses? Oh, Mr. President, we forgot to tell you, we took some, we rejiggered them so they don't work anymore. And he said, oh, man. He goes to sleep, right? He gets up the next morning and he writes, excellent. I know about this all the time. I know everything. A direct quote. Now, whoa, he knew about this all the time. Well, that's because Israel was winning. Just a couple hours later, what did he say? I didn't know anything about this. That's when Israel started losing. Hello? Truth doesn't much matter to this guy, okay? Now, so what I'm saying is that if my scenario is correct, and it wasn't a matter of gross duplicity, stupid duplicity on the part of our government in Washington. In other words, saying one day, oh, we're hopeful for the negotiations, then blessing Netanyahu as he does just the opposite the next day. If it was more a matter of gross mousetrapping, well, that's got to have some effect on that thick skull that Trump has. And I think he's less likely to be mousetrapped like that again. I think there are already signs that he's really ticked off at the Israelis for what they did the last hours of that period before the ceasefire. So who knows what will happen? The basic reality is there's a new reality on the ground. The Iranians have shown themselves to been able to have a deterrent. We thought it was a deterrent, but the Israelis thought they could decapitate them and get the U.S. in before the deterrent worked. And indeed, it wasn't a deterrent, but it was an offensive, a counteroffensive, which wreaked havoc in Israel, the extent to which we're deliberately deprived from knowing because of Israeli censorship. So it doesn't look very good for Bibi Netanyahu. I think Trump will dance around, try to take credit for a ceasefire. Let's see how long that lasts. I don't know. I can't really predict how long it will last. But the situation on the ground is what's going to dictate this. And Iran has won hands down without having to beseech Russia or China or India or anybody else, Turkey, anybody else for extra support. But they'll get it if they need it in extremis.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a subject of debate as to how embattled the Iranian forces were. I mean, they were subjected to widespread airstrikes across the country, and despite their claims that they had shot down, F-35s, I don't think there was ever any evidence supported for that. Uh, they have been able to clearly defeat the vanguard of American air defense. I mean, the multi-layered THAAD, the David Sling, the Arrow, the Patriots, the Iron Dome, defeating the best weapon missile defense systems that the West has, but they did incur some pretty substantial damage themselves. And I guess the question is of how long could they sustain continuous attacks like that if now you have more U.S. assets moving into the region? And at what point do you think the Iranians would consciously pursue nuclear weapons? Because now they're politically, anyways, they've passed legislation, and I don't know if it's been ratified by the National Security Council yet, to get out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is kind of a sign that, hey, we're going to make a run for the nukes. So, I'm not so convinced that the Iranians won it hands down, and I'm not so convinced that they won't actually try to pursue nuclear weapons. Now, I mean, if I were them, I probably would, because you look at what happens with North Korea, we leave them alone because they have nuclear weapons. So what do you think about that? What do you think about their leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the damage that they've sustained, and whether or not they might pursue a nuclear weapon?
Well, let me start by impersonating Tucker Carlson and putting you in the place of Ted Cruz, senator from Texas. Ted, what's the population of Iran?
I don't know.
It was
2 million?
92 million, okay?
Yeah.
What's the population of Israel? Oh, you don't know that either, huh, Ted? Okay, it's about 10, 12 million, okay? What's the size? Well, I won't even ask you about the geography. If you want to find Iran, go to Europe and then go a little bit down to the right, and you'll see it. It's a pretty big place, okay? Now, sorry for doing that, but because a lot of people don't know diddly about Iran and its strength and its power and its breadth and its expertise in science and technology. Why do they kill all these nuclear scientists? Because they're really good at what they do. Do they have any students? Well, yeah, they do. Are they going to kill them all? No, they're not. So, will Iran go for a nuclear weapon? I don't know. This fatwa, this religious edict that Khamenei issued back in 2003, we Muslims don't do this kind of thing. We're not going to go for a nuclear weapon. Well, apparently that is held till now amid great provocation from Israel and from others. What's changed, of course, is that Iran now has hypersonic missiles. They can't obliterate, pardon the word, Israel, but they can do a hell of a lot of damage and cannot be defended against, right? Okay. So what will happen? I don't know. The leaving of the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's a really serious thing. I mean, I remember when that was concluded, I was on active duty with the CIA, so to speak. That was a monumental task to get all those countries to agree to that. And of course, part of the agreement was that those who did have nuclear weapons were supposed to dismantle them, were supposed to gradually decrease them. Not much of that has happened over recent years. So, but it will still be a blow to the international regime. Uh, does Iran think it has to do that? I don't think so. It's done just pretty well. Thank you very much so far. It can reverse its decision, and depending on who you listen to, within a couple of years, a couple of months, a couple of weeks. I mean, Scott Ritter even says it could be just a couple of weeks. They could get a nuclear weapon, but I would be inclined to think no. The supreme leader is going to say we're above that. We have ways to defend ourselves. We have really powerful allies. They don't want us to go nuclear. Russia, China. The last thing I want is Iran to go nuclear. So,
Why
so
don't
I,
they
you
want
know,
why don't they want Iran to go nuclear?
well, that lets the genie out of the bag, doesn't it? That lets every damn country in the world figure, well, the only way they have to defend themselves is a nuclear weapon. And, Iran is right near Russia, right across the Persian Gulf. The winds going from Iran cannot be persuaded to just go south. Okay. The fallout is a problem. And it's just the whole business of still other powerful countries who don't really need a nuclear weapon, having them, producing them, and violating this regime. It's since the late 60s, early 70s that this regime has been in place. It's not been perfect, but it has put the lid on gross proliferation. And it has sort of made a matter of conscience to the nuclear powers. Hey, you really agreed to limit or decrease your nuclear potential. It just makes really good sense. So my guess is that the Ayatollah or the supreme leader will not reverse himself right now. Doesn't really have to. He could. Of course, he's got ample provocation. There are forces in Iran that would say you're silly. Look at North Korea, just like you just said. Look at North Korea and the others. But so far they've resisted that. To them, a fatwa is taken much more seriously than we Catholics take an encyclical or some other high pronounced thing from the Vatican. Those are sort of non-binding. Fatwas, in contrast, are binding as hell, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know enough about the fatwa to know if it's sacrosanct and not just open to interpretation. We do know that the Iranians have been making the rounds. The foreign minister went to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin the day, I think, after the bombings. And now today, the Iranian defense minister, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Aziz Nazarizadeh, arrived in Beijing following the bombing of the facilities. So clearly something is being discussed, some sort of deterrence, because clearly their air defense was not as formidable as a lot of people thought. And presumably this would probably embolden the United States to do another sortie, maybe next time with tactical nuclear weapons, for all we know, in order to try to truly do some damage to these underground facilities, which are vast and unending, as you indicated. Iran is a vast country. I found myself for about an hour last night on Google Earth, just kind of going all around and looking at all the various mountain ranges. And I mean, yeah, in terms of boots on the ground, forget about it. But air campaigns, there's a lot of soft targets that could really disrupt their economy. So what do you think they're going to get from the Russians and the Chinese, and why haven't they got it already?
They're, in my view, they're going to get, hey, listen, Iranians, be calm, be cautious. We have your back. Don't jump to any big conclusion that you have to go nuclear. You don't. We not only helped you develop hypersonic missiles, we can do other things to help you. Now, did you keep a careful record of how you fixed the air defense for those 8 hours when they weren't working there in the evening of June 2nd, 12th, and or morning of June? Did you keep a record of how you fixed that? Oh, good. Will you share that with us? Because we don't want that to happen again. It's not going to happen again. We have more sophisticated stuff. If you ask us for it, we'll give it to you. What's really curious here is that the Russians have been really coy about this. Putin said, you know, we offered them a mutual defense treaty, and they said no. And instead, they settled for something much less. And besides that, they haven't even asked us now for a whole surge of military weaponry. It's really interesting. Now, what's the lesson there? The Iranians made a bad mistake. Pezeshkian, the new prime minister or president, he decided that, you know, maybe he could persuade the Americans to get rid of the sanctions. Maybe if they made nice with the Americans, and maybe if they negotiate with the Americans, maybe, you know, we're not a threat to America, for God's sake. They know that. It's just all has to do with Israel. So let's negotiate. And if we're going to negotiate with the Americans, I mean, the last thing to do is sign a mutual defense treaty with Russia, for God's sake. So let's put the Russians off. They put the Russians off for 2.5 years. Okay? And in the end, in January of this year, the thing was signed, but it was less than a mutual defense treaty of the kind that Russia has with North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
That's big. They do have one with North Korea. With China, no, they don't have one, but it's tantamount to one. It's all but one in name, and the same would apply to Iran in extremis. Iran is not in extremis. Who is in extremis? Israel, from everything I've been able to glean over the last couple of days. Now, that's not necessarily good news because everyone, including Russia, China, the Iranians, and Trump, are worried that in extremis, we got a Samson option that this fellow Netanyahu might employ because he's a psychopath. He's a sociopath. He doesn't care about the suffering of other human beings, and he's prepared to do just about anything to keep his rear end out of jail. My God. Well, that's the conclusion I draw from this. I think there are many in Washington and elsewhere that draw the same conclusion.
Like, we know the Syrians, they had the S-400, and maybe obviously Syria has fallen, you know, from Russia's grip, or at least parts of it anyways, the Assad regime, which was backed by Russia. Is there something to do with Iranian sovereignty that they are concerned that if they were to bring the Russians in because of the dual interests with respect to having so many Russian-speaking Israelis, could they not be concerned that maybe they can't trust the Russians? Like, are the Iranians genuinely concerned that they can't trust the Russians, maybe less so the Chinese, or is it just pride and not wanting to, you know, wanting to be self-reliant and not wanting to rely on another nation that caused them to not make this deal, which would have effectively extended some nuclear umbrella over them to possibly prevent or forestall these attacks?
That's a good question. I just point out again that it was the Iranians that turned down thumbs down on the mutual defense treaty. So that suggests that well, the way I explain that is or try to explain it, is that they saw more benefit in trying out the U.S. to see if the U.S. was serious on the sanctions and everything else
Mhm.
and negotiations, and they could maybe just do something a little bit less with Russia. That being the case, I don't know if it's a matter of trust so much as Russia has always made sure that Iran was not a threat to its underbelly. There are all kinds of trade routes and everything else that go in that direction. Caspian Sea is right there. Uh, I just think that the Russians are really as concerned with respect to what eventuates in Iran as they are in Ukraine. The same sort of situation. They feel encircled. They feel, under the Shah, it was a real menace to Russia, and that was part of the reason we supported the Shah. So it all has to do with people who might have some common sense. Who knows? Maybe there are still lurking some in the corners of Washington. Maybe they'll get to Trump and say, "Look, I don't know what these fatheads are telling you, but my God, are you going to let Bibi Netanyahu mousetrap you again? Mousetrap you with the discreet support of neocons who whisper in his ear, 'Don't worry about it, Bibi. We got it covered. The president will have to join in if you get in real trouble.'" Well, that I think is what happened so far. The result has not been such as to encourage this kind of logic or this kind of mousetrapping to succeed soon again. So I have a relatively glass half full notion on that. Maybe even the ceasefire will proceed, and you know, I just think that if Israel uses the ceasefire to order more Patriot missiles that don't work, I mean, it's surreal, isn't it? They don't work, but they need more of them. They're stealing them from Netanyahu. They don't work there either, but they work better than. Oh my God, just crazy. So what's going to happen? Well, I was going to say only Trump knows, but I don't think that's all right either. I think only God knows. And God's had quite a challenge these last days. I don't think she knows what Trump is thinking day to day any more than we do.
There was I remember about a year or so ago, you had talked about how you suspected that when conventional capabilities had run their course or exhausted their utility in these conflicts, that ultimately the Ukrainians at that time would potentially, or NATO, of course, Ukraine is a proxy of NATO, would attempt to do some sort of propagation utilizing tactical or mini nukes, as you call them. Is that something that could potentially be in play here? Because it seems if it's politically expedient for Netanyahu to remain in power and sustain this conflict, to remain in power, that he would potentially have to resort to more extreme measures in order to get the attention. Do you see that strategy still being employed in either theater that NATO might seek to? Because what we've seen with the attacks on the nuclear bombers recently, that was pretty extreme, and that happened on Trump's watch. So just because I guess Zelensky's in a suit doesn't necessarily mean that they're out of potential tricks. Are you still of the persuasion that that's an option that they're entertaining?
That was a fear I had toward the end of the Biden regime. Now, I didn't even appreciate fully that Biden was pretty much out of it. Now, with Sullivan and Blinken, I mean, is that good news that they're ruling the roost? No, it wasn't. They don't know anything from nothing. Okay. So that's what I was worried about. That after these other set of escalatory weaponry didn't work, and we tried this and we tried now the tanks, and now the now the F-16s or whatever, the F-18. Well, what would the next step be? Well, we got those mini nukes on the top shelf there, Mr. President. Do you want us to unlock that and use those? I mean, these guys were crazy. So that's what I was worried about then. I'm not so worried about it now. As crazy as Trump may be, I think he's, it's hard to say, isn't it? I think he's more commonsensical than these people who are running things for Biden. Now, would Netanyahu be tempted to do that? Well, as I'm saying, in extremis, yeah, he would. And that's, I think, the whole purpose of U.S. policy for the ceasefire. The Russians and the Chinese, everybody else saying, look, Supreme Leader, we got your back. You made a bad bet that you could negotiate with the Americans. You know how that came out. But you're viable. You got more weapons and more missiles than Israel has. We got you covered. And I don't think there's any real chance of Netanyahu, in current circumstances, using his nuclear weapons. In other words, just to sum up, I think that's the thrust of this whole business, not only Russia, China, but the U.S. in trying to say, look, we'd really like to tamp this down, lest Netanyahu get in such extremis, as we say, that he would find no other way out of his dilemma than to pull that nuclear rabbit out of the hat. And that would be, well, you all know what that would be. That would be terrible, not only for the non-proliferation treaty, but everybody who lived in that area. And I remind you, Russia lives in that area, and so do many of the Gulf states and Egypt. And, it just would be bedlam. So there's a real premium on the cooperation of people, U.S., Russia, China, in my view, to prevent that from happening, making sure that Netanyahu realizes, okay, that didn't work, but hold your fire. You're still in power. We're going to, not rub it in. Just don't even think of using nuclear weapons. I think that's the game right now. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I remember in a recent tweet, I can't remember the specific wording, but you had said something with respect to, it was directed at the captain of the Nimitz. I don't know if it'd be a captain or admiral or how that works.
No, I checked that out. He's a captain. The admirals tell the captains what to do, but the captains run the ships, and in this case, the USS Nimitz.
Okay. And it was something about cautioning about succumbing to potential false flag attack. What was your motivation for that?
Past precedent.
Right.
The Israelis are really good at false flag attacks. When I saw that the USS Nimitz was ordered to leave Japanese waters and make the trek to Mideast waters, I said, oh, wow. We Americans have this expression, I'm going to get my ducks in a row. That usually means to get your act together, get things organized, right? But it doesn't work with aircraft carriers. And now, when the Nimitz gets there in a couple of days, there'll be 3 sitting ducks in a row. There won't be in a row, but it doesn't matter anymore. With these missiles that have unerring accuracy, they are sitting ducks in a row. So I said to myself, my God, somebody ought to tell the captain of the Nimitz that when he's attacked, as he probably will be, try to figure out where the attack was coming from. Like, was it from Israel or where was it, a submarine or whatever it was? Don't automatically assume that it was those Iranians, and don't buy into the immediate propaganda that it was the Iranians, and now you got to hit the Iranians directly. Think about the USS Liberty. Most Americans don't know about the USS Liberty, but suffice it to say, it was a Navy intelligence ship in international waters off the coast of Sinai during the first war there, Six-Day War in 1967. It was attacked deliberately by Israeli warplanes and by three Israeli torpedo boats. It was torpedoed and they tried to sink it. Thankfully, one enterprising sailor from Texas took some baling wire and got one of the antennae that hadn't been working before to work. He sent out an SOS. Otherwise, that entire ship would be sunk with its 300 sailors on it. So, what does that show? Well, did they kill anyone? Yeah, 34 U.S. sailors. Wounded? Yeah, 172 U.S. sailors. Oh, were they called on that? No. U.S. Army and U.S. Navy and the Secretary of Defense and a president named Lyndon B. Johnson covered it up. Johnson himself telling the commander of the Sixth Fleet Squadron, who had sent airplanes from his carriers to do battle with whoever it was that was attacking the Liberty, tell him, call it back. Call it back. I don't want to embarrass our good ally, Israel. That's how bad it is, folks. So what I was trying to tell this captain is, look, if this happens to you, okay, don't do what the people on the Liberty were enjoined not to do. In other words, they were told not to say a word to their wives. They were not to say a word to each other or one another about who did this to them for years and years. So, Mr. Captain of the USS Nimitz, be aware this happened before. The Israelis knew that they could get away with murder. This proved it, murder of U.S. servicemen. So if it happens to you, don't knee-jerkedly say, oh, yeah, it was the Iranians, because the whole thing would be Israel's attempt to get the U.S. with 2 feet into the war, which, of course, is Netanyahu's ultimate objective. Now, did it happen? Not yet. Do I exclude it from happening? No, it's not only the Nimitz. There are 2 other carriers. One is in the area. One is steaming toward Israel now in the Mediterranean. These things are sitting ducks. Okay, so let me just finish here. That I put that thing out. Boom, it was an X, right? I don't know when the last time is that I got more than 500,000 hits. 500,000 looks on it, And somebody said to me, "Hey, maybe one of those was the skipper of the USS Nimitz." I said, "Well, I hope, but nothing can be excluded. But when you get over 500,000 hits on an X, you're allowed to have thoughts of grandeur, right? And say, well, maybe this will work. Maybe if and when one of those carriers is hit, they will think twice before adopting the school solution. It had to be those damn Iranians."
Yeah, because there's a lot of ways that could happen. The Mossad claims they're going to continue their operations inside Iran. So if they've co-opted some Ukrainian vessels, there's naval drones that they could utilize. And it doesn't even have to be the Nimitz. It could be, a myriad of warships that are less well defended as a strike carrier group. So I think you're, having had that seen by 500,000 people and counting could potentially, I don't want to say derail the plan, but it would certainly create a lot of dissident voices if and when it arose around the issue. A lot of people would be very critical and skeptical about it.
Well, I hope. And when I use the Nimitz or other aircraft carriers as sitting duck examples, the others can be hit with to be gross about it. The Nimitz is this big, right? The other ships are this big or this big or this big. Talk about sitting ducks. I mean, you couldn't have better target practice than have an aircraft carrier. They're ships of the last century, for God's sake. They worked great in World War II. They're vestigial. And the Nimitz, this is a little ironical, but the Nimitz is set for the scrap heap when it finishes this mission due back in Norfolk to be scrapped. So,
Yeah.
wow, it takes a lot of money to scrap a aircraft carrier. And, if the Iranians scrap it, well, and besides, 5,000 sailors? Come on. We had 34 killed on the Liberty, 5,000. We can always get new 5,000 sailors. My God. Those are the kinds of thinking that go on in Washington. It's not the armed service that I signed up for back in 1961 to be a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Intelligence and Infantry. We were proud of our service there, and we had a certain confidence in our leaders. Turned out we had too much confidence because it was not but soon thereafter that they tried to get rid of Kennedy and try to do all kinds of things, which so far they've not been able to succeed in doing totally. So it's a very different situation with the military now. The people who rise to the top are bootlickers, they're sycophants, and if you want some examples, just take the most recent ones. General Milley. Brown, I don't know so much about, but this guy, what's his name? Raisin Kane. I mean, he's out of Central Casting. Looks real good. Good briefer. Does he know what he's talking about? I don't know, but I don't think so, because the way you rise up to those exalted levels is by saluting sharply and telling the commander, your superior officer. Now, let me tell you a little vignette. A friend of mine from high school went to West Point, right? Another friend also two guys went to West Point, and they had a 30-year reunion. And my friend Clem was a 3-star general. And my friend Maurice was a major. And this is an apocryphal story. The major went to the general and he said, "General, I'm so proud of you. How'd you do this? How'd you do this?" "Well, it's very easy. When your commander comes up with an idea, no matter how harebrained it is, you say, 'Yes, sir, excellent idea.'" But that's a crock of shit. That's what you always used to say, Maurice. And you're a major, right? "I'm a general." Well, God, I've seen it happen not only in the military, but in the intelligence services as well, which I served. Maybe it's a natural function, but what you end up with is a bunch of sycophants at the top, handpicked by people like Trump because they'll do what they're told. And, for this guy to get up from the Air Force and say, yep, this has been obliterated, and without even having the initial bomb damage assessment, well, that shows what kind of sycophant he is. One of the things these days is that you not only have satellite photography from really sensitive sources like the U.S. military, but you have civilian.
Mm-hmm.
You have civilian satellite photography. Do they have the capability, that is, the White House, to fix up the photos that come from these civilian collectors so that it looks like there was more damage than there really was? I don't think so. So it's a matter of who you believe. And if Margaret Brennan and that CNN reporter that challenged Trump this morning, if there are any hint as to what's to come, maybe even portions of the main media will say, this is a crock. We're gonna face this guy down. He never tells the truth. We're gonna ask him embarrassing questions. And if Rubio is allowed to come before the cameras again, we'll be ready for him. maybe he won't last very long as both Secretary of State and Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. My God, what have we come to?
It's interesting that you make a point about civilian intelligence gathering. I just have one last question for you with respect to your experience in providing the intel brief to the president. At that time, obviously, the civilian population didn't have access to the internet, so they didn't have these tentacles that could reach out and get information in real time. Do you think that that has changed the equation? I know you hinted at it earlier that now these politicians are perhaps being held to task by a more aware population. I mean, as much as there is accurate information, there's also a lot of disinformation. But how on par is the information that comes off Telegram and X, like from on the ground open source intelligence? Is it commensurate with the information that maybe the president himself is getting? Like, is the quality of the information becoming more comparable?
No, it's not. Uh, what the president should be getting is of a quality far superior to what these other collection things are. Um, and that's big because the president should be able to know before anybody else what the real story is. Um, when I was briefing President Reagan's top advisors, Secretary Weinberger of Defense, for example, Secretary Shultz, it was just then that real-time satellite intelligence was coming down. It was really exciting. I mean, Weinberger, for example, knew that billions and billions had been invested in making this possible. So one day I'm in there and I'm saying that, well, the latest on the Iranian offensive against Iraq in this little sector is that the Iranians have succeeded in making 5 kilometers. He says, "You mean yesterday?" I said, "No, sir, I mean this morning." And the bells go on. And he says, "Aha, you're telling me something that was just imaged 2 hours ago." So that's the kind of stuff that we have. Now, there's another little story I should tell, is that what we lacked was what was called a dwell capability. We would have these satellites go around maybe twice a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
But smart people would know when they're going to be photographing this and that, and they would be able to conceal it.
Right.
We needed a dwell capability. And so the Pentagon went to work and the CIA, and they got them. And you know what they're called?
Is it the geo-locked or?
They're called drones.
Oh, drones. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then some Pentagon general says, "Wow, so you get somebody photographing what's going on right there and stay there for 36. I'll bet we could put a missile on one of those damn things." And there you get drones with missiles on them. My God, it was clear as a day. It was developed so that they could be real-time dwell capability. We want to watch this nuclear site and we want to be there for 36 hours. They got drones and then they put missiles on them. My God, I'm talking late 90s and so forth. So these things just kind of spiral out of control. And without anybody thinking about, well, maybe we ought to control the development. Maybe we ought to talk to our potential adversaries and say, look, this is put a whole new dimension on wars. No. We say, we're going to get the best drones. And we did have the best drones 20 years ago, and now we don't have the best drones anymore. But there's a lot of people making a whole lot of money out of all this. Last thing I'll say about the media. The media is controlled by the other parts of what I call the Mickey Mat, okay? Very briefly, Eisenhower on his way out said, the MIC the MIC, the military-industrial complex, is something we really have to fear because it's gaining power well beyond what they need, and it's a threat to our democracy. The only way to protect this from growing out of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, give me a break, out of shape, is a well-informed citizenry. Now, that was the military-industrial complex. Here's my new acronym: Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia Think Tank Complex. Okay. Mickey Matt.
Wrong.
Sort of rhymes a little with Mickey Mouse, so you can remember. Mickey Matt. Now, why did I say media as if in all capital letters? Well, because media is the fulcrum here. It's the bedrock. If you don't control the media, none of the rest of the stuff works. And who controls the media? 6 members, multi-corporations of the Mickey Mouse. So the whole thing is so incestuous that what Eisenhower warned about, that only a well-informed citizenry can find out how this works and how to prevent it. Well, they've been figured out. The Mickey Mouse has a way of figuring that out. They put the news and the commentary parts of the media under the same corporations that profiteer on the war making capabilities. So let's take a multinational. What percent of their income comes from their news and commentary operation? 3%? 10%? I don't know, but it's minuscule compared to the profiteering that comes of building tanks and aircraft carriers that don't work. Okay, doesn't matter they don't work. A lot of people get a lot of money. So this is what we're up against, and that's why. Well, maybe we can put it this way: Margaret Brennan, she acted like a real reporter last Sunday. Will she be around next Sunday? I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a chance that she will be given some sort of sinecure. Margaret, please study at Harvard for a year and cool off because you shouldn't be so mean to poor Marco Rubio. Pardon me, but it gets pretty. I mean, you have to laugh so that you keep not your sense of humor, but what's left of your sanity.
Well, let's just hope they take it to such an extreme sooner than later that the whole thing collapses, the whole artifice collapses. I want to thank you for coming out today. And where can people find more information about you? And do you do a blog or anything?
Yeah, I have a website. It's called raymcgovern.com. And thanks for asking, because my webmeister, who happens to be one of our sons, always really reams me out if I forget to mention.
Yeah.
raymcgovern.com. And he has made it really easily searchable. Okay. So there's a search window in there. If you want to find out something I wrote within the last 20 years, you can find it if you put in the right words. And the other thing I'm in is, I do a lot of tweeting or Xing, if you will. It's at Ray McGovern, and I'm on Facebook. And if you look on what's called YouTube, I do a lot of interviews like this. And will this be on YouTube?
Absolutely. Yep. Should be pretty soon here.
Okay.
So
well,
yeah, I would encourage people just go, watch a lot of stuff on YouTube. You're pretty ubiquitous in terms of your presence on here. I see you on Dialogue Works all the time, as well as many other. Judge Napolitano, I think you've been on there as well. So
well, yeah. I don't know what ubiquitous means, but I get around.
Well, you've been around, and that's why we wanted to get you on, and we greatly appreciate your time today, Ray. So you take care, and let's hope that this thing calms down. But I'm gonna stay vigilant because I'm not.
Yeah, it
overly
takes
optimistic.
us. Yeah, there's only us, and we need to make our voices heard despite all the impediments. we need to keep trying. And I applaud you, and I'm grateful for giving me the opportunity to say these things such as they are.
Anytime. It's a privilege. Thanks a lot.
Most welcome.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.